All right. Here we go. So, hello and welcome. Oh, I should probably start the presentation, huh? There we go. All right. So, hello and welcome. For those of you whose first times it is, or whose first time, this presentation is going to be great. Thank you, guys. So for those of you who are here for the first time, hello and welcome. This is CodeSeoul. I'm Beege, and today we're going to go over how to give awesome presentations. We do, just because we have a bunch of new people today, I'm going to do a little bit of marketing. So CodeSeoul is a free community. Everything we do is free, and that is the promise. We run all sorts of events in education. We also have people watching online. But our goal is to build a community where people can feel eager and safe to learn, get better at tech, meet other people, all this kind of stuff. So thank you for being here and joining in that. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So today is how to give awesome presentations. So first off, I'm Beege. I'm the presenter today. You might be like, who's this guy that he thinks he can teach me how to present? I've done a lot of stuff. I've worked at a bunch of different companies. I've done all sorts of technical work, but now I'm a product manager, so I don't get to write code anymore, which is why I like this meetup a lot. But I also do a lot of presentations, a lot of communication, a lot of presenting really technical things to some not so technical people. And I've been doing that part for a while. So I'd like to think I'm well qualified for this. Additionally, usually I do a disclaimer being like, oh, I'm not an expert, I haven't written a book about this, but this one's a bit different. I've been presenting and being in front of people since I was very young, very, very young, since I was 5. So I'm quite confident in pretty much everything I'm going to tell you. And if there's something I'm not confident about, I'll let you know. All right? That's just, you don't have to read that whole thing now. It's just some fun little trivia. So on to the actual content. And I promise it's going to be slower than that intro. So we're going to go over what makes a presentation awesome, okay? So we have this goal of doing an awesome presentation, but what does that mean? So we'll start with the definition. Following that, we'll go over kind of the flow and structure of a presentation, how to make sure that things make sense, okay, as you go on through the presentation. Following that, we'll go ahead and talk about actually preparing slides. If you need to prepare slides, you don't always need to. Following that, we'll go over your mental state. If you're someone who gets nervous speaking in front of people, or you're afraid that you'll lock up or something, or that you'll make a totally weird grammar error at the very beginning of a presentation, right? We'll cover how to handle that. We'll talk about how to use your voice, because when you're presenting, you are talking with people. So how do you use your voice to do that? Then we'll talk about managing the audience. It's a little bit more difficult with larger audiences, but we can talk about that. And we'll talk about what to do when things go wrong. Not if, when, because things will always go wrong. Any questions about what we plan to cover today, besides like the content itself? Is there anything people want to talk about that's not covered here?
Are you managing the audience now?
Yes. Very good. Also, another thing that I need to tell folks, the people who've been here before, like, yes, again, Beege, okay. When I stop and ask for questions, I will wait an uncomfortably long amount of time. And that is intentional, because it takes people time to think about their question, think about how they're going to ask it, summon up the courage to ask it, and then actually say it. We'll actually talk about that a bit during the presentation, but just to have you be prepared for when I ask for questions, be ready to wait for a little bit, okay? And also feel safe having time to come up with a question. Good? Cool. So let's dive in. So what makes a presentation awesome? If any of you guys have seen How I Met Your Mother, this totally makes sense. I'm guessing not many have because they're not laughing and smiling, but that's okay, except this guy. So first off is engagement, okay? If people are engaged, if they're paying attention, if they're like, I am invested in this, you've pretty much won most of the time. Additionally is organization, okay? When a presentation makes sense, when people feel like they have an idea of what's going on, how things are working, that also makes a presentation awesome. People feel like they can understand things better. On that note, flow. Things should follow a logical progression. People shouldn't feel like they're getting jerked around mentally as things are happening, okay? Additionally, energy, right? We're not going to talk about that in detail too much. It's kind of more of a meta thing, but you don't want to sit and do presentations like this. People are going to stop paying attention unless you're doing it to emphasize a point, okay? And lastly, inspiration. And inspiration is the key part. Inspiration is the purpose of a presentation. You are trying to inspire someone to do something, whether it's to learn a new skill that they have acquired from your presentation, or go learn more about some domain area, or inspire them to some kind of action, right? If you look at TED Talks, and if you look at the TED Talk formula, all of it is about inspiring people to do something or feel some certain way. Okay, that's the whole point. So hopefully, by the end of this presentation, I will have inspired you to go give presentations yourself. That's the point of this. So at the end, let me know if we succeeded. But my thesis basically is that if you can accomplish all of these qualities in your presentation, you win. People will feel like that was an awesome presentation, and they can come away feeling like they had a good experience, like they learned something new, and that they have a new ability to do something. They're inspired to do that thing. Does that make sense? Any questions? Cool. Yeah, it's a little uncomfortable, right? All right, so let's move on. So on to flow and structure of material. So first off, this is especially true when you're giving technical presentations because, at CodeSeoul, we do a lot of IT stuff. That's our purpose. So most things are technical. You must absolutely make sure to cover the basics of what you're presenting. You need to define terms, especially the fundamental ones, okay? So for example, if you're teaching someone programming for the first time, you need to spend like 10 minutes explaining what the hell a variable is, okay? Now that can be difficult when you are advanced in something, right? When you are so advanced in a topic that the really basic stuff feels second nature, it's really difficult to stop and spend the time to explain this concept where you feel like it's almost impossible for someone to not understand it. But I can guarantee you, someone doesn't understand it, and you need to make sure to take care of them and take the time and put in the effort to make sure they understand it. As for making sure they understand it, that's, woo! You guys okay? Do you need paper towels or something? Okay. I got you. Here. Okay, that's fine. Cool. On the note of energy, right, you need to spend time making sure people understand the basics before you move forward. Has everyone got that basics part? Cool. And then next up, on the note of basics, a lot of times, especially when you're teaching skills, which is most of what we do here at CodeSeoul, we teach complicated things, right? So you want to layer the knowledge. And again, going back to basics, if someone's shaky on the basics, when you try to build on top of it, that's not going to work so great if the basics are not clear. And you need to make sure that things make sense. They follow a logical order, right? So you don't want to start teaching about like class for those of you who know object-oriented programming, you don't want to teach someone about like instances of a class before they understand what a variable is, right? Or if we want to go to the example of riding a bike, right, which maybe more people can understand, you don't want to talk about how the pedals work unless someone understands what a wheel is, right? You have to build this knowledge on top of each other step by step. Next up is omission, right? It is okay to leave things out. In order to maintain time, you need to, okay? So when you're doing this kind of building of knowledge, you need to make sure if you decide to remove some part, is the rest of your presentation okay? Do things still make sense? Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about omission later. Just keep in mind how important, useful, and frequently various bits of information come up. If it's not important, it's not very useful, and it doesn't come up a lot of times, maybe you don't need to talk about it, okay? Next up is partitioning, okay? You need to make sure that when you have various concepts, right, you need to make sure they are separated. Why? Because if everything's just kind of a stream of consciousness, it's going to be hard for people to organize the information in their mind, okay? So you need to say, this is concept A. That is the box it fits in. This is concept B. This is the box it fits in. And if people can kind of treat these as individual concepts that they can kind of collect, think of like you're giving someone tools to put in their tool belt, right? It makes much more sense than if you just give them like a giant jelly, right? Or a giant gummy, I guess in Korea. So you want to, when you come across new concepts, you give them names, okay? You say, this is partitioning. This is what partitioning is. This is how it works. This is when you use it, okay? And then make it clear when you have started talking about a topic and when we have now finished talking about partitioning. Make sense? Cool. And then on that note is transitions, right? So I've actually been doing it a bunch already, right? When we talk about basics going into knowledge layering, right? You start with the basics and you build on top of it. That's layering, right? But if the layers aren't partitioned properly, then everything kind of becomes a mess, right? And as we talk about starting and ending a partition goes into a transition, right? Every little thing should connect, okay? The reason for this is twofold. One, it makes sure that the experience for your audience is smooth, okay? They don't feel like they're getting jerked around to different places, okay? Things feel like they make sense. People feel safe. Learning is hard. New information is complicated. The easier you can make it on people, the better. And additionally, when you transition properly, what you're doing is you're establishing connections between the previous information, like partitioning, and the new information, which is transitioning. And as you kind of make these links, the way we remember things, we remember information that's connected to each other, right? And so that falls into memory tricks, okay? If you are teaching a skill, like presenting, it's a very meta presentation, right? If you're teaching a skill, you want to use memory tricks because chances are a skill is composed of many small bits of information, okay? And you need to make sure that people can remember these things. So what are some memory tricks? Well, it's complicated. We actually did a whole presentation a few months ago on memory tricks. It's linked in the notes, and I'll share it in the Discord too, so you guys can check it out later. But to kind of summarize some things, people remember information that's connected, like with transitions, right? They remember things framed in a physical space, right? So earlier when we talked about like a bicycle and wheels, right? You can imagine a physical bicycle in front of you with the wheels and that you have to talk about things in order, right? Being able to visualize these things helps. And then if it kind of follows a narrative, right? If you can kind of make a story out of things, which is a little more difficult and not applicable to everything, that can help people remember things better, right? So there's a high probability that you have some memory in your mind associated with making memories, right? And it's usually related to some kind of story you experienced or some kind of striking visual thing you might remember, okay? And then lastly, which is also a memory trick, but it's so important that I want to mention it as its own point, repetition. You want to repeat things, but in an interesting way. For example, just on this slide alone, I've been repeating about basics, knowledge layering, right? Omission, partitioning, all these kinds of things. Because yes, these other memory tricks like physical space, doing things in kind of a narrative way, these are very helpful, but the most effective way to get you to remember something is repeating it, period. That always trumps any other method. So this is especially true for the basics, okay? Which works out, because if you're building knowledge on top of each other, you want to constantly remind people of the basics. You want to remind people of the lower layers so that things continue to make sense as you build. Your foundation, if you think about imagine you're building like a pyramid or something, right? Your foundation needs to be the strongest and the largest, right? So you reinforce that in someone's mind by repeating it over and over again. Repeat the basics, just keep doing it. Like I've done, I think, 4 or 5 times now, okay? So does that all make sense so far? It's a lot, right? And kind of a meta note that I actually don't have in the notes here and I'll add later. When it comes to structuring your presentation, especially for more advanced topics like presenting, usually a presentation is not meant for deep dives and deep knowledge, right? If you really need deep information, you need to go read documentation online or something, right? Or watch a 6-hour video, maybe not that long, but watch a lot of long videos, right? So don't focus on getting every little detail right in perfect high resolution. It's only introductory. If you don't spend a huge amount of time on everything, that's okay. Just touch on things, make sure people have enough knowledge to get a general understanding, and then move on, okay? And we'll talk about that on the slide side a little bit. The key point is people are aware that such a concept exists, and then hint, if you share your slides with people, they can go back and check it later if they don't remember well. And we'll cover that again in a second. So any questions about what we've covered here? Cool. I know that the beginning of this is not super interactive. It's going to get more fun in a bit, I promise. Okay? So preparing slides, right? Now, one thing I really want to cover, slides are optional. You do not need slides for every single presentation. Jay's actually pretty good at this. He's done a few presentations where he didn't have slides. They just jumped right into coding, and it worked. But it only works for certain topics, okay? You have a bunch of tools in your toolkit, which we're going to talk about today. Make sure to use them at the right time, the right place. Don't use a hammer for a screw, right? You're just going to cause more trouble. So first off, if we have decided that we're going to do slides, right, we need a strategy for it, okay? And there are certain kind of rules that we want to follow. So for kind of technical or procedural topics, like things where you have very complicated information that you need to follow steps, slides, okay? If it's something more philosophical, something more emotional, for example, like TED Talks, honestly, they don't need slides, right? You could go without them because it's just, you talking, you getting people to think about things, right? You don't need an image to do that, okay? So, on to the actual content. How do you prepare slides? You've decided, okay, I need slides for this presentation. How do I do that? First off, minimal text. If you are reading your slides, you have made a mistake. Why? Because, one, reading slides is boring. I'm sure you've gone to a presentation, everything's in the slides, and you're like, do I need to sit here? I could just read this on my own time, right? We've all felt that. Secondly, if your audience is reading the slide, they're not listening to you. For example, you'll notice I do a little bit of exposition at each new slide for slides where I have some text, because that little bit of exposition is not super important, and I know you're going to be reading this more than listening to me. So anticipate that kind of stuff and kind of work it into your presentation. Next up, images and diagrams. They are good, okay, generally. Especially for more complex topics, you can represent structure a lot more effectively in a diagram. So if anyone's ever done systems design, right, like infrastructure design, right, you have, this client hits the load balancer, talks to this auto-scaling group, talks to a message bus, talks to a back-end service, talks to a database, right? Me describing that, you're like, bro, what the hell was that? But if you see a diagram, you can be like, oh, So be sure to use these kinds of visual aids if you were to imagine someone explaining something to you, and there's so many little pieces you need to keep in your head at once, diagram it, okay? Now, that said, don't rely too much on diagrams, okay? Diagrams need to be simple. For example, this guy, right? There are way more complicated flow diagrams than this, right? And this is meant to be humorous, okay? The problem is if something like this was too complicated, there was too much text, it was too long, you're going to be like, man, I don't want to read all that, right? So try to keep your stuff simple. On that note, you want your presentation, the visual part, you don't want it to be distracting, okay? If you put an animation on there, it needs to be short, okay? Animations can be really fun. They can help drive engagement. That's great. Don't make it too long because, again, they're going to get wrapped up watching the presentation and not listening to you, okay? So I think there was some presentation I did in the past. Oh, right, that was with Lunit. I found this really cute animation of like a conveyor belt, and they're like little rabbits like doing stuff on the conveyor belt, and they're all bouncy and cute, stuff like that. No one was listening to me. So watch that you don't make things too distracting, okay? Again, like earlier with the not too much text on the slides, if people are reading the slides or watching some activity on the slide, they're not listening to you, okay? If it's just something that they could read, you wouldn't be doing a presentation, or at least you shouldn't be. And another thing to remind, the slides, the visual part of the slides does not need to contain all the information, okay? It's just a reference, okay? It's a mental anchor. So if I'm explaining something, right? And we can just do it after, Jay. It's okay. Yeah. Yeah, so it's fine. So if, for example, you're during a presentation, you get totally distracted by something, right? It's totally fine. The slides are meant to act as kind of a mental anchor. Like what were we talking again? Oh yeah, we were talking about the non-distracting stuff, okay? So that's the purpose of the slides, okay? So if you're thinking, okay, but if I have no text, right, and I'm not supposed to go too deep in the slides, like what about people who either look at the presentation after I've given the presentation? Or what if people don't want to go watch a 2-hour video to remember what the hell was going on in the presentation? Well, notes, right? Most presentation software has a bunch of notes. Don't read all that stuff. Right? That's why it's not on the slides. You can read it later. It's basically the same thing I'm talking now. But most presentation software has notes. So if you can put all the details in the notes, and that way your presentation can focus more on, or the visual part of the presentation can just focus on kind of acting as a reference, right? And then people later on, they can reference your notes and they're still okay. Okay? The notes are kind of your safety net. Also, the notes just help you present, okay? Now, the whole balancing notes and speaking, we're going to cover that a little bit later, okay? Speaking of later, when you prepare your presentation, right, you don't want to just make it once and then go, even though that might have totally been what I did with this because I ran out of time. But in an ideal situation, you want to write up your presentation, and then you want to get away from it, okay? Because the way our minds work, we think about the stuff that we did, whether consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously, whatever word is correct. And when you come back to something, you come at it having done a little bit of thought about it, but also with a fresh perspective. I'm sure we've all experienced this where you walk away from a problem, you come back to it, and you're like, oh, the solution's obvious, right? We've all experienced this. It's the same thing with presentations and most work. So once you've done a draft of things, get away from it for a bit. Now, that's only possible if you have time in advance of the presentation. If you're doing it last minute, try to force a break. Maybe go get water for 5 minutes or something and think about puppies or rabbits or something, or I don't know. I guess I like puppies. And then come back to it, okay? Give your brain that little time to rest, to have a new perspective, and come back to it. And on that note of kind of reviewing it and coming back to it later, the next thing, you want to make sure to iterate. Don't do it in one shot. Keep modifying it. Keep changing it. You're always going to find better ways to do it, okay? You could theoretically spend an eternity making your presentation better and better and better and better, okay? Now don't do that, right? Perfect is the enemy of good. But don't just do one draft. Don't even do 2 drafts. Try to do like 3 or 4. And when I say draft, I don't mean like redo the whole presentation. I'm just saying kind of go through it and just tweak stuff, okay? Yeah, and then lastly, as you iterate, your focus should be on reducing content, okay? Because you're always going to think you're faster than you are, okay? You will run out of time. People who have watched presentations at CodeSeoul, whether I'm doing them or someone else is doing them, we often run out of time. Granted, that's because like here at CodeSeoul, we usually start 10 or 15 minutes late, but we budget our time for the whole 2 hours. So then we end 10 or 15 minutes late. We're working on fixing that. But keep that in mind. You want to reduce your content as much as possible, especially because if you happen to be an expert in what you're presenting, which, hint, you don't always have to be, but if you happen to be an expert on something, or at least more knowledgeable than your audience, you want to give them time to ask you questions, okay? And if you finish early, you have time for questions. If you go over, okay? Does that all make sense? Cool. Questions about this stuff? Cool. Yeah, it's still uncomfortable, right? You're going to remember that part. So, on that note, after you've prepared your slides, right? You've gotten ready for your presentation. You walk into the room. It's full of people. And you're like, oh, shit. Right? How do you manage your mental state? Okay? How do you keep yourself from getting nervous? Okay? The biggest thing is being familiar with the material. If you know what you're going to present, that solves half the battle. Because a lot of people tend to get nervous about, what if I forget to talk about this? Or what if I say the wrong thing about that? Be familiar with your slides. Know what you presented. Make sure you review your slides right before you present. That way you're not as worried about forgetting stuff. Okay? Also, notes help with this stuff too. Okay? Make as many safety nets as you can. Okay? So another thing too. Now I'll cover that in a minute. And on the note of kind of being familiar with your slides, right? As you're reviewing your slides, imagine presenting them, okay? Kind of simulate your presentation in your head. Be like, okay, I walk into the room. There's like 50 people. I shit my pants for a minute. And then I start talking. There we go. And then just kind of run through, okay, I do this slide. I can do a joke at this slide. I can talk about this thing, this kind of stuff, okay? Kind of plan it out in your head. But also accept that it's not going to go to plan, okay? There's going to be distractions. Things are going to go wrong. Acknowledge that in advance. Otherwise, you're going to start freaking out. You don't want to freak out, okay? But on the note of freaking out, you're going to be busy during a presentation, okay? Presentation is an extreme practice in multitasking, okay? Because, well, you're going to be doing a lot of stuff. You're going to be observing the audience. You're going to be thinking about, what do I need to talk about next? You need to be thinking about, am I speaking clearly? Am I using the right tools that I'm going to teach you in just a couple of minutes, right? You have to be thinking about all these things at once. It is a multitasker's dream. It is a tunnel vision person's nightmare, okay? But if you're busy doing all of this stuff, thinking about all this mental work you have to do, you don't have time to be nervous, right? You don't have time to think about, oh, did I mess that up? Doesn't matter. I'm observing to see, okay, is everyone understanding what I'm talking about? Do they seem engaged? Okay, what can I do to fix that, right? You don't have time to kind of reflect on yourself, all right? If you're doing that, you can't be nervous, and you're probably winning at that point, okay? And then kind of on that note, some general confidence tips. Just be prepared, right? And when I say be prepared, I don't mean like, oh, prepare for all the possibilities. It's more accept that you cannot be 100% prepared. Things are going to go wrong, right? Things are going to be distracting. People are going to come late. People are going to spill their drinks. All sorts of stuff is going to happen, right? And it's okay. We're humans. Reality is not perfect. If you can accept that stuff, if you can kind of forgive yourself in advance and forgive everyone else too, you don't have anything to be nervous about, because everything that could possibly have gone wrong, you've already accepted. Okay? And again, if you're thinking about all this other stuff that's going on, you don't have time to be nervous, okay? So focus on the work you have to do. Then you don't have to worry about confidence. And lastly, acknowledge your imperfection. Again, you're human. You make mistakes. Help your audience understand that you are human, okay? Help them understand that you're trying to do your best. You want to give them a good experience. You want them to learn what you have to share with them. But you're not perfect, and they're not too, and we're all just trying our best. Okay? Does that make sense so far? Cool. Questions about this stuff? Cool. Every time we're going to chuckle at that. So now let's get into more of the mechanical stuff, the actual act of presenting. Most of a presentation is talking, okay? So, water is good. Oh God, water is good. And we talk with our voice. So if you're not thinking about how you can use your voice during a presentation, you're not using your most important tool, right? So be aware of your voice. There are different tips and tricks you can do with your voice to make the presentation better. First off is volume, okay? You want to make sure that, A, you're loud enough for everyone to hear, okay? Maybe you have a quiet voice, maybe you can use a microphone or something. But there's way more to it than just making sure people can hear you. For example, I can make it very clear that this is important by increasing my voice. Or if I just want to say like, oh, there's this stuff, there's this thing, and it just kind of, it's not so important, you can kind of just not think about it so much, right? This kind of stuff, okay? Use your voice to emphasize these sorts of things, okay? You can do it as a whole sentence, you can do it as an individual word, you can do it as a phrase, whatever. Just be aware that volume is a tool you can use. Now, maybe you have a quiet voice, right? Maybe you don't have a lot of kind of power in your voice. Now we're going to start the fun interactive stuff, okay? You can use your diaphragm. So, it's going to be awkward. So like, if you think about, oh God, I did not mentally prepare for this. So, this is where your voice comes from, right? Like, yes, this controls pitch and stuff, but this is all where the power comes from, right? We know our lungs are up here, right? But your lungs are not the part doing the work. We're getting into a little bit of biology here, okay? Your lungs are just where the air gets stored. The power actually comes from down here, like the upper part of your belly. This is called the diaphragm, okay? And the diaphragm is where your power comes from, okay? So when you breathe, right, you don't your chest gets a little bit bigger, but if you take a big breath, your chest will raise a little bit, but your diaphragm should come out a little bit, because that's what's pushing. And then when you're being loud, your diaphragm pushes back a little bit, right? So let's try it, okay? So kind of stand up straight, right? Stand up straight. Let's do it. Come on. If you can, all right? And kind of, if you're too self-conscious, don't worry about it. But if you're comfortable, kind of feel your body here, okay? Feel where your lungs are. Feel where your diaphragm is, right? It's just below your rib cage, okay? Now kind of take a deep breath and kind of feel your diaphragm. Right? You feel your chest go up a little bit, and if you're doing it right, you feel your belly come out, okay? Now let's breathe a little bit, because I don't want you guys to pass out, all right? And now, what we're going to do, I'm going to explain it before you try it, okay? Fill up your diaphragm, don't do it yet, and then kind of talk normally, right? You should have a lot of breath, and then say something really loud. I'm going to tell you what to say in just a second, okay? So we're going to say, after we've filled up our diaphragm, we're going to say, I can talk normally, and then push real hard, I can talk loudly, but don't be yelling up here, push from down here, okay? Everyone ready? All right, so we're going to take the deep breath, and then we're going to say the stuff, okay? So breath, I can talk quietly, and then I can talk loudly.
I can talk loudly.
Ooh, over here. Okay, so we're going to do it again, but some people, now this is where my singing background comes in, some people still did it up here. I could hear where it was in your voice. Yeah. If you're pushing from here, okay, you're gonna burn out your voice real quick. You know when you're talking a lot and your voice gets raspy, right? That's because you're pushing the energy from here. You're trying to use your vocal cords to make it louder. Don't do that. You want to relax your vocal cords, okay? And you want to push from here, okay? I was not pushing from there that time. But think about like using your muscle here to push inwards to squeeze the air out of your lungs as you talk, okay? So we're going to do the same thing again. I can talk quietly, I can talk loudly, okay, after we take a big breath using our diaphragm, okay? So ready? Take a big breath. I can talk quietly. I can talk loudly.
I can talk loudly.
Ooh, that was actually much better, especially over here. You guys were mostly good at the beginning. Over here got a lot better that second time around. So good job, guys. We can sit down now. So, promised you it'd be a little more fun, right? So, make sure that you use this, right? Because otherwise you can burn out your voice. Or maybe if you have a quieter voice, you can use this to make yourself louder, just generally. And then you can use that for emphasis or to kind of play things down. All good? Cool. Next up is pitch. Pitch is very useful for displaying emotion. You can do that with volume too, but pitch can be a little bit more effective. For example, you can display nervousness by getting into a high pitch because people get kind of tightened up and their vocal cords tighten when they get nervous, right? Or if you want to be very serious and emphasize that something is very important, you can lower your voice in pitch. Now, I kind of have a deep-ish, not really. When I talk normally, it's towards the bottom of my range anyway. But you can use this to kind of just display different emotions. Those are just two basic examples. But let's do some exercise, right? We're going to say, I am nervous, and they're going to say, this is important, okay? I am nervous in high voice. This is important in low voice, okay? Are you ready? So, I am nervous. Come on, let's do it. I am nervous. This is important. This is important. Cool, okay? Now, I know this is really silly, and you're like, Beege, why are we doing this? Right? Because this stuff feels silly, right? The first time you're doing it, like out of any kind of context. But if you get more comfortable doing it, if you become more comfortable using these different parts of your voice to express yourself doing a presentation, you're not going to be so nervous about it. You're going to be more open to it, right? It's like kind of shock exposure therapy, right? If something's like nervous and weird, but then you do it, you're like, oh, that's not so bad. So that's why we're doing it. So does that make sense? Cool. And the last one, and one of my favorite ones, pacing. Pacing, again, like pitch, can be used for emotion. It can also be used for attention. For example, if you want people to feel kind of anxious or anxiety, like you're trying to kind of remind them of some experience, maybe that you want them to avoid, you can talk about how at the beginning, the pacing is pretty normal. It's your normal speaking, but then as the process gets more complicated and becomes more stressful and things just keep happening, and you start to get nervous, and now it's like, oh my God, everything's going so fast. What do? I can't understand what the presenter is saying because his English is crazy, right? That feels a little stressful, right? You can use this method in your pacing to kind of manage the audience's emotions. Additionally, humans, we pay attention to change, okay? Change in volume, change in pitch, change in pacing. These get our attention. We are hardwired to observe change. Because back in the olden days, when you're like in the woods or something, everything's still and quiet, you're cool. The birds are chirping, everything's cool. The birds go quiet, you're like, oh, something's bad, right? We are wired to identify change, okay? For me, pacing seems to be the biggest change when I'm listening to someone speak. Maybe it's different for other people, but make sure that you can use all these different tools to kind of attract people's attention. But going back to pacing specifically, again, you can use fast pace to kind of make people feel anxious and kind of display bad things, right? Or you can also use it to display confidence. So you can be like, yeah, I can talk about this, I can talk about that, I can just go this, that, it's no problem. You keep a kind of steady pitch, but you keep going fast and it feels like, yeah, I got stuff, it's okay. And that's a nice transition into speaking slowly. You can speak slowly to denote also confidence when put next to speaking quickly. And you can use speaking slowly to emphasize importance. Okay? So when you stop and you talk about things in a much slower voice than you have been using, it's a change and people pay attention. But it makes things, if something is slow, it seems more important to us. Okay? Now the cool part is in technology, there's a lot of really important stuff we need to teach amidst all the less important stuff, especially when it comes to security. People who've been to some of my technical presentations know this. When I talk about security stuff, I tend to be loud and talk like this for security things, because that is like maximum importance. If you're loud and you're slow and your voice is deep, you're listening, right? So keep that in mind. But all that said, don't overuse these things, okay? You want to have kind of a steady, stable voice, and then you only want to use these things for emphasis, okay? Don't use these kind of highlights, these importance markers for everything, because if everything is important, nothing is important. People don't know what to pay attention to, okay? Does that make sense? Does everyone have a little bit of an better understanding about how to use their voice? Cool. Questions? Yeah.
How do you practice slower pacing? Because I find my issue is that I talk really fast sometimes. I get really into the subject matter, and because I'm so enthusiastic, I can feel that I might overwhelm the other person. So is there a mental trick or some type of I just need to slow down. So what do you recommend?
Are you asking in a general sense or when you're doing emphasis?
In a general sense, like in a presentation. Like if I were you right now, I'd be talking really fast.
Yeah, so for the benefit of the stream, the question was, how can you practice slowing down your voice for general use during a presentation? So you're not just rambling super fast and people can actually parse what you're saying. There's a mental trick that I use that I personally recommend is we have different personas, right? You behave differently around your friends than around your family than around your coworkers, right? You can make kind of a presenter's persona, right? My presenter's persona, yeah. Okay. My presenter's persona is kind of like some almost monk-esque kind of guy who's like very calm, knows his stuff, and just kind of wants to emphasize the gravity and the peace of the knowledge, right? So when I'm presenting, I'm kind of thinking in that style. So that's one trick that I use. There's also just straight up practice. There's also asking feedback. But there's a couple, actually, that transitions into the next slide. So I'm going to ask you to pause that for a second. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
It's a two-part question. There's one time I had to prepare this PowerPoint slide for my senior manager, and it was the stuff was like a very new technology, and like as I was studying it, I was not very familiar with the technology. But in I want to present as much as information as possible.
Mm.
Because like it's hard to grasp the information, and at that time, is there a better way of preparing slide? And how you at that time, and I was nervous too.
Mm.
Because I was not really familiar with the concept as well.
Mm.
Like, so when I presented, I just started talking with this high school science teacher that just explained every information word by word.
Mm.
Is there a way how you handle your voice and preparing slide?
Mm. Okay, so I'm going to repeat your question for the stream, and then if I didn't understand it, please correct me. So the question was, if you have to present on a technical topic, or really maybe any topic that you're not so familiar with, how do you kind of summarize things and not do like 100 slides? And how do you also kind of explain things in a manner that's interesting, not like a high school teacher, which is an unfortunate metaphor actually, and kind of make sure you're not too nervous. So, did that capture all of it? Okay. So, so a lot of it is some of the stuff we covered, right? So, for example, you want to focus on the basics, right? So what are the concepts? What are the key ideas of the thing that you need to understand before anything else can work? So you should front load that information, right? Start with that and just keep repeating it. And then make sure you build on top of it, right? And then on the point of omission, if something seems less important, or during your studies, if something is mentioned less often, you can leave it out completely, or you can just say, there's this thing, I don't think it's very important, we can look it up if we need to, but that exists, I'm going to move on, okay? And if it's kind of a new technology, this is going more specific to your use case, and with my personal experience, if I ask a team member to research a new technology for me, what I really care about is it useful for our team? Is it better than the tools we're using? And what are the basic concepts I need to understand to go study the rest? And so if I know those three things, the rest I can figure out on my own. Again, like I mentioned earlier, presentations are just meant as introductions. They're not meant to give all the details, right? If someone wants you to give them all the details, they shouldn't be asking you for a presentation. So it should just be introductory stuff. What's on the getting started page? What's on the concepts page, right? What's on the when should you use this tool page? Does that make some amount of sense for the first part?
It's like a dilemma because when I was researching about the technology, but actually the senior manager has to sell that technology to another vendor, client.
Oh.
And as personally, I didn't like that technology, but I had to present it because it's like I had to work for the company.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a weird dilemma, I think, when I present it.
Mm.
And it's hard for me to say, oh, this technology is really bad for my senior manager, I think, especially in the current company.
Mm.
So, yeah, so that's, I understand the point, but I had an issue because it's like,
Yeah, so for purposes of time, I'm going to kind of answer this part and then tie it off, and we can come back to it later. We can talk about it more during dinner or just after the presentation. But so for the benefit of the stream, what if you don't necessarily like the material that you're presenting, or you're not sure it'll solve the needs of the person, or they have to go and in turn present it to someone else? Is that kind of a good summary?
yeah.
Okay. So if you don't like the material, that's kind of rough. But what you can do is turn it into a game where maybe you don't like it, but you want to figure out why other people like it, right? So if someone believes something like super crazy and you're like, that doesn't make any sense, how the hell do these people like it? That's a point of curiosity for you. You can kind of go figure that out. And then as you're kind of learning the things that people find interesting about it that you didn't know, because if there wasn't something interesting about it, you would have never heard about it in the first place, right? So once you identify those things, those reasons that people find it interesting, you can focus on those for your presentation, and you can use that as kind of selection criteria. And as for like presenting it to customers, or rather providing information for other people to present, basically the same thing I mentioned before, like, what is it useful for? When should I use it? What are the basic concepts, right? Like that's what a customer is going to want to know too. And then kind of another comment about your general situation is, ask for feedback. Be like, hey, I'm planning to do this with in a work setting where you're presenting for someone else and your manager has asked you to present. Ask your manager as you're working on the presentation, hey, I'm planning to do this. I'm planning to have this agenda. I'm planning to do this structure. Is this what you're looking for, or am I doing the completely wrong thing? And if your manager doesn't really give you feedback when you ask that, prepare your resume and try to find somewhere better. But going on a slight tangent for a second, I'm of the firm belief that a manager's purpose is to make sure their team members are successful, because the reason a manager has a team is because they can't do all the work themselves. If they can do all the work themselves, they shouldn't have a team. So it's the manager's goal to make sure you can do your job. If the manager is not helping you do your job, you need to make that manager help you do your job. Also, the labor laws in Korea are really good. It's really hard to fire someone. And if they treat you poorly, there's really good laws around protection from bullying. So don't be afraid, unless you're an English teacher and your contract's expiring. In which case, I am so sorry. But yeah, I hope that helps a little bit. But what's up?
Can I add something about that situation?
If it's brief, sure.
Sure. It's also possible that your manager, in case they're on the other sheet, that they just want you to teach them about the technology rather than presenting. So the scope of that type of presentation would be totally different from something like Beege is saying. I've been at a toxic company where the manager just didn't want to take the effort to learn about the thing, so he just made his underlings perform for him to teach him. So if that applies in your case, it's kind of a no-win situation. You get out of there. Trust me, better place.
So to summarize for the stream what Andre said, because I don't think the mic may be able to hear him. He was saying some less than great managers may kind of use their team members as kind of teachers. Say, hey, go learn this and then teach me the thing. That situation just kind of sucks. I will say that there are some cases where that's actually a good strategy if it's kind of like a manager level summary that the manager wants to acquire but doesn't have the time to, which is what I was assuming that you were describing. But you kind of have to check with the manager if that's what they're looking for, or if they would just want you to be Songsae님. They just want you to teach them how to do the tool. But yeah, thank you, Andre. Okay, so any other questions about this stuff? And we can talk more about that later. What did I ask you to put a pin in? I already forgot.
The pacing question?
Oh, right. So, thank you. Crap. Yeah, so I mentioned the persona thing. The other way that you can kind of help, the problem is the persona thing, you're not keeping it in mind the whole time. So there's a high chance that you'll kind of forget about it after the first 5 minutes. But there's other things you can do to kind of help maintain yourself, including your pacing, your volume, whatever, while you're presenting. And that is the practice of managing the audience. Okay, now we're back into the flow. As you are presenting, and this is where all the crazy multitasking stuff comes in, right? You need to observe your audience, okay? Are people paying attention, all right? Do people look tired? Do they look engaged, right? If people are like this, hello. If people are like this or something, right? They're much more engaged, right? If they're leaning forward. If they're just like this, they don't want to be there anymore, right? You can watch people's body language. Now, on that note, some people are not great at parsing body language. There's a lot of really nice short books about body language if you feel like you can't read it, so I definitely recommend them. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but if you search for it, it'll come up. I actually studied that in high school a little bit because I did not know how to social. But observe people, try to figure out, are they engaged, are they paying attention? So that's for the engagement part, right? But then this is what's more useful for your pacing thing. Do people look confused? Do they look bored? Do they look like they understand what's going on? If you just talked about something and people are like kind of looking at you like this, like, I'm not sure I really get that, maybe you went too fast, right? And you can use observing the audience. When you see these kind of negative signals that people are not paying attention or they look confused, you can be like, okay, I did something wrong. I need to go back and fix that. Okay? That could be pacing. That could be volume. That could be the way you structured the information. There's a whole bunch of different stuff. And I'm going to break the flow a little bit here. But when it comes to when you get these negative signals, you can ask people like, hey, looks like people aren't understanding that. What part didn't make sense? And then if you're lucky to have a good audience, if you kind of developed a rapport with your audience, they'll answer. They'll be like, that was way too fast. You'd be like, okay, I'll slow down and say it again, right? Or that was way too much. Can you break it down, right? Now, on the note of just feedback generally, whether it's in a presentation or like at work or something, if you say, what did I do wrong? People are going to be like, shit, man, I don't know. It was just bad, right? Now, hopefully no one says it like that to you. But you could say, did I say that too fast? If you know it's a problem that you have. Did I say that too fast? Do you need me to repeat it slower? If people go yes, you're like, cool, okay. If people are like, okay, that wasn't the problem. Was it too complicated, right? You can ask these kind of feedback questions to figure out where you went wrong, okay? And then if people do look like they're checked out, like if it's more the boredom thing, you can use a lot of the tools we talked about earlier to get their attention. When maybe something important is coming up next in the presentation, you can be like, this is important, right? They're going to be like, oh, I should pay attention now, right? Or you can also use the pacing and things like this too. And then if you find that people are having trouble paying attention generally, maybe it's a really advanced topic, or maybe it's a really kind of slow topic, you can use metaphors and stories. I haven't been using a lot of them in this one. I have a few prepared, but I haven't been using them because your engagement's been pretty good, right? When I ask questions, everyone's like, they laugh. When I ask if things make sense, a lot of you have been like nodding your head and this kind of stuff. So I've been getting a lot of positive signals, very few negative signals, except for the people who, I'm not going to go there. But I think they're kind of multitasking, and that's totally fine. So, kind of use the tools when you need them. Sometimes you can prepare stuff, like stories and whatnot, and maybe you don't need it, and that's cool. Save the time. You're going to need it later. Next up is eye contact. On the note of observing people, right? If people are engaged, they're going to be looking at you, and you can use that opportunity to make eye contact with them. Why would you want to make eye contact with people, right? It's a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. But if you do it just briefly, it's not so bad, right? You probably noticed, I make eye contact with a bunch of you. Some people in the back, it's a little harder. Or if the audience is big, it's a little harder, right? In terms of a really, really, really big audience, just pick like the first 3 or 4 rows and just kind of scan through those and just do quick little looks. You'll especially notice that when I ask for questions, I'll kind of check each person. Part of that is observing to see if you're thinking about stuff and you need a little bit more time to kind of get it out of your head. And it's also just to make sure that I take a moment to kind of make eye contact with everyone. So why? It makes things feel more personal, right? In terms of engagement, right? Humans are social creatures. Whether you're introverted, extroverted, whatever, we all want some kind of connection, right? And making eye contact with people is just a very minor way of building connection, okay? People feel the most engaged in a presentation when they feel like, I kind of have a personal relationship with the presenter, right? So doing this tiny little thing just periodically throughout the presentation goes a long way, helps keep people engaged. Now, one thing is to balance among the audience, right? That can be a little bit tricky, okay? Especially like I naturally want to focus here because this is where the most people are. This is the center of the room. But I also have to make sure that I go over here too. Otherwise, people are going to feel left out, right? If the purpose of doing eye contact is to help people feel connected, but then you're not connecting with various groups of people, you've kind of lost them, right? So one thing to keep in mind. Now, there are times to break that rule. If there's a few people that do seem really engaged, right? Spend a little bit more time looking at them, okay? Or if there's someone who comes in and out of engagement a lot, give them a little bit more time looking at them, check in with them more often. Especially if you are kind of trying to build a community, maybe an IT community where people can feel good learning together. Again, you want to kind of develop that more personal relationship, or at least the appearance of it. And for the people that are highly engaged, if you're making a lot of eye contact with them, they're going to be like, oh, maybe I can talk to that guy afterwards or something, right? So that's something to keep in mind, but don't skew too much. Instead of being like this, you want to be like this, okay? Just a little bit more for those people. Make sense? Cool. What's up?
For eye contact,
Hmm.
do you also consider position of the people in the room?
What do you...
Those who are of a higher position?
Ah.
Would you have more eye contact with them, or would you just generally have it like shared equally?
So for the benefit of the stream, the question was, when you're making eye contact with people, do you consider their position, like their rank, title, this kind of stuff? So me personally, no, but that's more for philosophical reasons. It depends on your goal, right? So actually, no, even with the philosophical stuff, it still depends on your goal. So for example, let's say you're doing a sales presentation, right? And let's say you happen to figure out, oh, that guy is like the guy who manages the budget, or they're the manager or something. Yeah, spend more time with them, absolutely. Also, thank you for the question. I get the feeling you kind of knew this, but you're like, he should talk about that. So thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a very good point. If your presentation's purpose is more important for some people than others, do give them more eye time. Again, thank you for that. But it's not always easy. And even then, still try to capture as many people as you can, but instead of being this, maybe it's a little more like this, because you don't know what's going on with your audience unless like you work with them every day. If you work with them every day, then you kind of have stuff figured out, right? But if it's an audience you're less familiar with, you don't know what kinds of connections they have, right? So like maybe like this guy's the CEO or something, and this guy is like, you know, some engineer, but maybe they go back like 20 years and they talk to each other all the time, right? And so if you're like constantly looking at this person and you're not looking at this person at all, they're going to have drastically different experiences, and that's going to cause a little bit of confusion when they talk with each other. So, you know, you still want to have some level of balance, but you kind of want to skew it depending on what the situation is. So I hate to give a kind of it depends answer, but does that make some amount of sense?
Yeah.
Cool. And thank you for asking. So other questions, since we're in question mode, before I proceed? Cool. Little shorter on those ones because we're in the middle of stuff. But on that note, man, I don't even have to, what the hell? Oh, okay. Asking questions is a good way to keep the audience, or asking for questions is a good way to keep the audience engaged. Also asking questions to the audience, but I've had mixed results with that. I tend to avoid asking the audience for questions because during a lecture style presentation, people, you know, they're not actively participating a lot. And so if you're singling someone out to like answer a question, that doesn't always feel great. So I tend to avoid that. But again, it depends on the setting. There may be instances where it makes sense. If it's like a training thing, like you're in a company and you're training people and they're going to do some job and you need to hold them accountable, absolutely ask them questions. But if it's something like this, it's more of a community thing. It's more kind of a general thing. I don't know who's going to use things in what way or how much it's important for different people. I tend to lean away from that. But it is important in all cases to ask the audience if they have questions, okay? The only case where it's a little less important, still important but less, is when it's a very, very large audience and you're tight on time, okay? In those cases, I do recommend still asking for questions for demonstration purposes, okay? So be like, any questions? Cool, good, right? People will kind of see through that a little bit, but it does give an opportunity where if someone has like a burning important question that they need to ask, you can be like, crap, that seems important. Okay, let's knock it out. And then you can try to answer it quickly and then move on. But at least give kind of the token action of it, okay? But the big thing is that in smaller presentations, groups like this size, you can, first off, you can make sure that your presentation is, answering the things people care about. And secondly, you can use it to kind of steer your presentation, right? So if I get like 3 questions about pacing, I'm gonna be like, maybe I should repeat some of the pacing stuff more. Maybe I should add some more pacing stuff, right? You can kind of use questions to steer your presentation, okay? And then the big thing with questions is audience engagement. If people feel like they can get the information they want out of you, they're gonna pay more attention. Make sense? Cool. And on that note of kind of like keeping people engaged, you want to make sure to call for attention. Again, if people look bored, use your tools. Call for their attention, right? Try to make things more interesting, right? Come up with a story if you can. Even if the story is terrible and it doesn't quite fit, that might even be better because then you can make a joke about it, right? You can tell some story and be like, that didn't make any sense, did it? But you paid attention. I should have come up with a story there, but I'm getting a little bit tired, so I couldn't come up with one on the fly. I apologize. But you want to, when people start to drift, you want to kind of like forcibly pull them back in. Unless you're kind of being forced to do the presentation and don't want to do it, in which case none of this matters. But try to make things interesting. And then on the note of making things interesting, on the note of calling for attention from people, you want to relate to them, okay? Because, again, we're human, social relationships are important to us. If we feel like we make a connection with the presenter, we're going to remember that stuff better, right? If you think about some of your most important memories, right, they're usually in relation to some person, right? Maybe a family member said something very important to you, or maybe a bunch of kids in school laughed at you or something, right? A lot of the stuff that impacts us is from other people. That's what causes us to remember things. So if you can make ways to relate with people through stories, right? Maybe you can tell a funny story about yourself that someone can be like, yeah, I've experienced that too. Or the eye contact stuff, right? All these ways, all these methods are ways to make connection with people and help them feel like they're connected to you, which will help them remember what the hell you talked about, okay? Because when you're listening to someone and you don't know anything about them and you don't care about them, you're not going to listen to them as much, right? So try to make that personal relationship. And then on the note of making sure that, things make sense for them, that they're going to remember it, you want to make sure that whatever you're telling them is relevant, okay? You want to make sure it's relevant to their lives. For example, with this group, this is a presentation about presenting, right? But I keep making references to IT stuff because this is an IT group. I know that a non-zero number of you are going to have experience in some kind of software programming, IT utility stuff, right? So I can use examples from that domain that are going to be relevant to you to help you remember what we talked about. Or in the case of maybe I don't know what the audience has done, I don't know what kind of background they come from, I can use more general stories to relate to people, like the bicycle thing, right? Everyone knows what a bicycle is. They've seen people riding a bicycle. Maybe they haven't ridden a bicycle themselves, but they get the idea, right? And that's something everyone can relate to. If you have the time, you do both. You tell a story that's kind of specialized to what you know some people have experience with, and then you tell another one as kind of a more general sense, okay? Again, that's only if either you have time to prepare the stories beforehand or you can come up with them on the fly. It's not a must-have, but it does very much help. Right. So, questions about managing the audience. We're almost done, I swear. Yeah.
Now you are presenting and then your boss says or someone says,
Right. Good question. Yeah. So for the people online, the question was, so you're presenting, maybe you're presenting for your boss, and then he says, you have 2 minutes left. What do you do? So there's a bunch of things to think about with this. First off, you should be constantly watching the clock. Ideally, that should not catch you by surprise. One thing that I like to do is every time I change slide, I look at the screen to kind of remind me what's next and remind me the stuff I need to talk about. Make a habit, when you change slide, if you're using slides, check the clock. Okay? Ideally, keep your taskbar up on the bottom. I don't have it up on the bottom here, but if you look at my notebook, I have the taskbar up down here. Check the clock. Or bring up a clock app on your phone or whatever. You can always just, like, if you get a stand like this or something where you can kind of stand it up, you can just turn on the always on clock, just kind of put it there. Just make a habit of change slide, look at clock, know how much time you have left. Okay? Because the best way to solve that situation is to not get into it in the first place. But that's not an answer to your question, so I'm actually going to answer your question. If you realize you're out of time, there's a few options. The easiest option, if the situation allows for it, is, and that's all we have for today, but next week we'll cover these parts, and then just tell them the rest of your presentation that you're going to cover next time. But the situation doesn't always allow for that. What you can do is, do you want to it could transition so nicely, but I'm going to hold off. You could also just say, hey, I'm running out of time. I want to share all this other stuff about this topic with you, but I have to run through it. So I'm going to go fast. I'd love to talk about it with you more afterwards, but we got to jam, okay? And then people are going to say okay, because what else are they going to do? Or if you're lucky, they might say, hey, we can do it for 30 minutes more or something, right? And then you either just burn through the slides as fast as you can, or you kind of schedule a follow-up. Yeah. So does that answer your question?
It does.
Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
Actually, I have some feedback.
Hmm.
Like, I think it depends on situation. Like, one is like your speech is totally, you already know it's 40 minutes and you have 2 minutes left. Another is it's random style. You just give speech and your boss said, oh, you have 2 minutes left. At that time, I was thinking maybe the boss is something wrong, or he thinks that I'm talking too much about one part and it's not the part he wants. So that's why I think maybe the boss doesn't boss that, so that, oh, if you just have 2 minutes just to finish your speech. So I think it depends on situation.
So I'm going to try to summarize for the stream. And I'm not sure I 100% captured it, so correct me if I don't say something right. But it could depend on the situation. Maybe it was just like, you have 2 minutes left for this part, or maybe your boss thinks you're going too fast or going too slow, or maybe your boss kind of gets it and wants to stop. Is that kind of what you were alluding to? Yeah. So that is a possibility too. I did not consider that based on how the question was answered, but yeah, that's a good consideration as well. If the situation allows, kind of figure out like 2 minutes for what? But the situation doesn't always allow that. Ideally, you have some kind of idea of the context where you can figure out what exactly that means. Or if it's a situation where you can't figure that out from the context, you're probably in a situation where you can ask what that means. But we have to adjust, try to be smart about it is basically the best thing I can say. I know it's not the most detailed, structured answer, but I hope it helps. Does that sound good? Cool. Other questions? Cool. So, in the event that something goes wrong, like you run out of time, there's a list of things of what to do when things go wrong, right? Man, these transitions are just popping today, guys. So this is kind of a process that happens, and you'll see me go through this a lot, or at least some number of these steps. You've probably even seen it happening today. First off, when things go wrong, acknowledge that they went wrong. Acknowledge that a mistake happened, right? or at least make it obvious that like, hey, this is a mistake. We all know this. Okay. If you can, make a joke about it, right? Kind of lighten the mood a little bit. Make people be like, yeah, that is stupid. That does happen, whatever. If it's a mistake, so if it's a mistake that you've made, not just kind of a situation going wrong, kind of explain what happened. So like, this is especially true when you're doing demos, right? Because demos always go wrong. But when a demo happens and something goes wrong, explain why it went wrong. Or if you don't know why it went wrong, you can say that too. And on that note, you want to apologize when things go wrong, whether it's your fault or not. Remember, a presentation is some part performance, so it doesn't really matter if it's your fault. Apologize because the whole experience now has a problem, and you're in charge of making sure the experience is good. Also, it kind of helps build trust, right? When you are presenting information to an audience, they are trusting that what you're telling them is true. They're trusting that what you're telling them is real. If you just spout off a bunch of bullshit, right, or you do something that makes you seem not trustworthy, they're going to be like, should I do what this guy just told me, right? You want to build that trust. Acknowledging your mistakes, apologizing for them is a way of building trust. And then if it is something that's like with the presentation itself, like maybe you're doing like a workshop or a demo or something and something breaks, solve the problem. Again, that goes back to building trust. Actually fix whatever went wrong. Don't try to skip over it, or at least try to fix it. Especially in the context of workshops, there will be times where something is broken, something's wrong with what you prepared, and maybe you can't figure out how to fix it. That can and will happen. It has happened to me too. And you just got to kind of run with it. Acknowledge, hey, I don't know what's wrong, okay? I spent, 5 minutes just now trying to fix it. I can't afford to spend more time fixing it. Otherwise, the rest of the presentation is screwed. So let's just set this aside for now. I'll solve it later, and I'll contact you with what the problem was and all that. If it's something like a public event, usually there's some method of communication, like Meetup or Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. Or you can be like, hey, if you want to figure out what was wrong, just come, or if you want to know why that went wrong, come talk to me afterwards. I can get your contact info and I can tell you why later, right? It does create more work for you, but presentations are work. That's a thing. But kind of develop this trust, make people get the impression that you're trying to do good things because, sharing knowledge is good things, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. But do manage your time with this stuff. Managing time, I haven't talked about it a whole lot throughout this presentation, with the exception of reducing slides. Reducing slides is the biggest way to save time, okay? Another thing is when mistakes happen, make sure that the time for those is limited, okay? Make sure that, okay, I spent 5 minutes on this, I need to move on, I'm sorry, next thing, okay? Does that make sense? Cool. The big thing about this whole what to do when things go wrong, right? This is important because things will go wrong, and as long as you have some idea of what to do, it can keep from breaking your confidence, okay? So this is really important to keep in mind. Yeah.
So, I had an experience where I was doing a presentation and like a person of authority, like there was like high up, like asking a question, and then I answered the question, but he kind of raised his voice and said you did not answer my question basically, but I did. So I went through all that. I was like, oh, maybe I didn't hear well and that, but like he had a straight face and like it didn't go well, that presentation after that, because like obviously that kind of made me shook. Like in that kind of situation, should I like retort by saying like, did I do something wrong or something?
So for the benefit of the stream, the question was, one audience member mentioned, giving a presentation and then someone high in the company asks a question answered the question, but then the person kind of raised their voice and said, you didn't answer my question, and that kind of made them shook and weren't sure how to handle it. First off, that sucks. I'm sorry you went through that, because giving presentations is stressful enough. But when that will happen a lot, actually, or I guess not too often here, luckily, but outside of CodeSeoul, I've had that happen to me a lot. Minus the raising voice part. That's alarming, and I would check environmental factors regarding that. But if someone says you haven't answered their question, but you feel like you have, depending on the dynamics of that exact situation, the options are, ask, can you rephrase the question? Because, you can say, I'm sorry, I obviously didn't understand your question. Can you try to say it in a different way to help me understand it? Or, in a case like this specific one, where it sounds like the person maybe was not being reasonable, especially if they raise their voice, you can ask, what kind of answer are you looking for? Right? Are you looking for like an actual solution? Now don't say the second part I'm going to say. You can ask, what kind of answer are you looking for, right? And then when they answer, you can think, okay, are they looking for a solution? Are they looking for some kind of emotional security? Are they looking just for their approval? Are they just looking to make me look bad, right? And then kind of respond accordingly, right? If they're looking for an actual solution, that's easy. Well, theoretically, that's easy if you're familiar with the material. If you're not familiar with the material, you don't know the solution, you can say, I don't know, but I will figure it out, and I can share the answer with you when I figure it out, right? If they're just looking for kind of emotional support of like, hey, what do you do when you do this? It's like, man, that sucks. I am so sorry that you're unhappy about this. I don't know what I can do for you, but we can talk about it if you want, right? Or if they just want to make you look bad, you can just kind of weaken the blow. You can say, well, I don't know the answer to your question, because maybe you do, right? But they just want to make you look bad, right? You say, oh, I don't know, but I can try to figure it out if you want to give me the time now, or we can figure it out later, right? Kind of going away from the presentation stuff and just more the general sense, the words I don't know are a wonderful thing, because you can use it to kind of deflect some stuff, right? And you see this in legal stuff a lot, which is a bit frustrating. But acknowledging that you don't know something, what are they going to do about that, right? It's like, well, you don't know this thing. What else can I do? Well, what about this? Well, dude, I just told you I don't know, right? So that's a pretty good defense. But only if you're acting in good faith, which I would hope people here would be, you say, but I can find out, or we can work together to find out, or maybe I can find someone who can find out, right? But without knowing more details about the situation, I don't know what exactly would have been the right path, but these are some options, right? So you can, ask for clarification on the question, you can ask what kind of answer they're looking for, or you can just kind of like, dude, I don't know, I'm sorry, how can I can help you figure it out later. Does that make some sense? Cool. Also, that super sucks, but yeah. Other questions? Yeah, go for it.
If you feel like they have higher status than you in that moment, and you kind of have to play the game a little bit, so you may want to validate them. That's a great question, one that I should have thought of. I didn't, but I'll get back with you again. So I think that'll kind of calm down. Yeah, you acknowledge it.
So just repeating that for the stream. One part I forgot to bring up that an audience member did is sometimes if they're looking for like emotional validation, kind of acknowledge and be like, man, that's a great question. I didn't think about that. Man, I should have done a better job, but thank you. We can figure it out or something. So yeah, thank you. That's really good. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, the Cool. All right, so to review, we went over what makes a presentation awesome, okay? Again, engagement, inspiration, Crap, I don't remember a lot of it. Oh, I'm bad at this. Right, engagement, organization, flow, energy, keep things high energy, keep people engaged, and then make sure people feel inspired to do whatever it is the purpose of your presentation is. We talked about the flow and structure of material. Talk about the basics, make sure those are covered. I should have put notes here, I'll do that in the future. Kind of layer knowledge. Don't be afraid to omit certain things if it makes sense. Make sure your transitions are good. Make sure you partition stuff properly, right? All these kinds of things. When you're preparing slides, right? Don't just do it all at once. Don't forget to kind of review stuff. Iterate on it. Try to reduce it. Don't put too much text on the screen. Use diagrams and images where it makes sense. Avoid distractions, right? All this kind of stuff. When it comes to managing your mental state, okay? Don't give yourself time to freak out, right? Make sure you're prepared. Make sure you're familiar with your information, familiar with your slides. Make sure to kind of do all the audience management work, right? To not give yourself the time to kind of freak out about stuff. And then for like using your voice, make sure volume, pacing, pitch, okay? Use these things to drive engagement, to emphasize importance, to generate certain emotions, certain feelings in your audience, okay? Again, don't forget to manage the audience. Observe them. Check if people are engaged. Check if they're understanding. Are they nodding like, yeah, I got it? Or are they like, right? This kind of stuff, okay? And then, kind of make eye contact with them. Use stories. Relate to them. Make sure things are relevant to their situation. All this kind of stuff. And lastly, when things go wrong, have a general plan. Acknowledge that there was a mistake. Make a joke about it if you can, right? Explain what happened. And then, try to fix it, right? All this kind of stuff. So, with all that, any questions about anything? I wanted to make sure that there was plenty of extra time at the end so that people could ask about personal experiences that they've been through. Like, we've had a couple of those already. But are there any other times where people are like, man, I did this during the presentation and it went terribly and I don't know how I could have done it better? Or is there any question about the material? Yeah. I'm sorry, one more time?
Pacing and hand gestures.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I think that's key too.
Mm.
When you do presentations, it's kind of like it drives them the point.
Mm.
Kind of like drive the whole different stuff. The way you express yourself is really key.
So one audience member wanted to add a comment emphasizing pacing is really important and gestures. I didn't mention gestures at all during the presentation. That was intentional because some people just really don't like gesturing during a presentation. And walking around, yeah. So if you are comfortable walking around and gesturing, it's a great idea. I didn't want to really push on it because some people really don't like it. Or there are situations where you can't. For example, I can't move from here because this is the microphone. We do have a setup where I can actually carry one of these microphones, but it requires like a couple of people to actually manage it, and we just don't have the leadership staff to kind of support that kind of stuff. But very good point. If you are comfortable gesturing, if you are comfortable walking around, remember we talked about energy when it comes to managing an audience. Those are great ways to add energy. And you've noticed me gesturing this whole time anyway. You probably figured that out. But yeah, if you're comfortable with that stuff, go for it. So thank you for that. Other comments, questions? Yeah.
So before this, through trial and error, I tried this method of not looking at the audience, and that did not go well. So I don't recommend that at all. Because I did that to not get nervous, but it was not good. And another one is what was it? It'll come out.
Okay, no problem. So just for the benefit of the stream, one audience member wanted to mention a tip as well. She tried not looking at the audience to kind of avoid getting nervous, and that did not help. And made things worse. And I can agree with that. There have been times where I've been on a stage where, it's really intense light and you can't see the audience. That sucks. Because one key thing is getting audience feedback. so that you can adjust. Because if you're doing something blind, you have no idea how to do stuff better if you're doing poorly, and you don't know if you're doing well. At least if the audience is kind of not engaged, you know you're doing something wrong and you can try different stuff to fix it. You have some control over the situation. But when you're not looking at the audience or when you can't see the audience, you lose a lot of control of the situation. So yeah, that's a really good point. Do check in with your audience. What's up?
By the way, PowerPoint, I solved the problem when I'm reading a presentation. I solved that problem looking just individual, the eyes.
That's a good point. I forgot to mention that. Thank you. So to corroborate that. Yeah. So if, again, I'm just repeating the stuff for the stream, I'm sorry. If looking at people in the eyes does make you nervous, kind of look just right here in between their eyes, kind of look at their forehead. It's close enough and it'll make you feel better, but they'll get the idea that there's eye contact. So very good tip. I had heard it a long time ago, but don't think about it anymore and didn't mention it. Very, very good tip.
Another, it came back to me. So when I was starting my career, my manager said because you get nervous easily, just read your kind of comments for the slides for the presentation. And like, I don't recommend that either. Even though the manager told me to do that, like the audience didn't like it.
Yeah. That's a good point. I actually forgot to mention it in here. I should add it in here later for the benefit of the stream. One audience member had gotten some feedback from my manager like, hey, I noticed you're nervous. Try reading the slides. It'll help you be less nervous. Yeah, it'll help you be less nervous, but the presentation's going to suck. People know when you're reading stuff. Usually what I do is I kind of have a script, and I kind of have key bullet points. Usually it's just the content of the slide, but that's because like I spend a lot of time making sure I'm familiar with the slides. But just having key points of a script of what topics to cover or specific ideas or stories to mention, that's really helpful. But if you're just straight up reading it, people are going to see it in the way that you speak. You know, we've all seen this. We know when someone's reading versus when someone is speaking naturally. And once you're just reading, they're like, dude, just send me what you're reading. So yeah, that's not great advice from your manager, but good that you at least learned that. Yeah.
Question on that note, how much time do you recommend maybe beginners to prep for the presentation? So obviously they're doing slides, they might do a quick little script. But like, is there an actual time where you might actually practice doing the presentation, or what prep time do you recommend?
Yeah, so the question was, how much prep time do you recommend for presentations? That's messy, because it depends. And I'm sorry, but I can tell you like what can scale it. So if you're doing a workshop, like especially a technical workshop where you're going to have the audience participate in stuff, that absolutely requires the most time. Because you should run through the steps in your workshop multiple times, the interactive parts, and you should try to make mistakes to anticipate what mistakes other people are going to make. Like maybe you click the wrong button, or maybe you enter a command wrong, because you should know how to fix it when people inevitably do it wrong. Also, I've not been using my diaphragm enough because I'm getting a bit scratchy up here. I'm sorry, I got distracted. Damn it. Right. When it comes to just lecture-style presentations, it does require significantly less time. But again, it depends on the complexity of the topic, right? More technical stuff, you're going to need more prep time, especially because you're going to have people who might know related things that you don't know, and they're going to ask, hey, is this thing like that thing? And you're going to have to answer like, I don't know, but we're going to have to kind of figure stuff out together. So you kind of have to think about things in a more abstract way for technical presentations. Try to kind of extract some theory from the content. So that's difficult. In terms of like hours for a guesstimate, for this presentation, I spent about 3 hours, which is very little. That's if you know the topic very well. You already have an idea of how you're going to structure it. That's like top tier stuff is 3 hours for a 2-hour presentation. Do not give yourself only 3 hours to do a presentation. As I was going through this, I was like, that's a mistake, that's a mistake, that's a mistake, right? This could have been way better if I had spent more time. If I had had more time this week, I probably would have targeted about 6 hours for a presentation like this. So it's 6 hours for a 2-hour presentation where I'm very familiar with the material. I already know kind of a structure I'm going to present it in, and it's not technical. So yeah, so 3 to 1 sounds good for like expert level. When I say expert level, I mean that you're familiar with the material. Maybe a bit more, but it also depends on like how much do you care, and how much source material do you have. So there are, when it comes to technical workshops, if you're basing your workshop off a tutorial, that can shave off a ton of time. It does still take a lot of time to kind of go through things and find possible mistakes, but that's a great way to save time. If you're doing a technical workshop, don't do it from scratch. Just don't. There's no good reason to do it unless you're doing like some cutting edge research. And then when it comes to non-technical stuff too, try to find reference material because it can improve your credibility because you can show your references at the end. But it also just takes less time. If you can be like, oh yeah, there's this. Oh yeah, I also remember this. This one, so I mentioned why it was fast because I'm familiar with the material, all this kind of stuff. But it was actually a little bit slow too because all of this came out of my head. Either from memory or from me analyzing past presentations. If I had used some references, it would have been faster, but I actively did not want to use references for this. So maybe a 3 to 1. Try that if you're familiar with the stuff. If you're less familiar, try 4 to 1 or 5 to 1. Does that make sense? Now that's just my guesstimate. I haven't gotten that part to an exact science. Usually when I do presentations, they're far enough in advance that I'm just going to spend however much time I need to spend. Because I don't do a lot of presentations at work, oddly enough. And those that I do, I make sure to schedule way in advance, like 2 or 3 weeks. So try to do that. If you have to give a presentation on the order of days, good luck. Try to allocate as much time as you can. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Cool. Other questions?
I have more additional questions.
Yeah.
When I was a student, I was a part of the some kind of a group about cross-Korea and refugees. And I prepared about 40 minutes presentation, but I have to spend about 12 hours. And there was a man who have a master's degree in political science and accepted to the NGO, and he precisely thought that you might spend 12 hours to prepare, and I said why. And maybe it was kind of a very difficult topic. I think that in that kind of case, maybe I have to spend about more than 10 times the time for the presentation. What do you think about that situation?
Right. So to summarize for the stream, one person in the audience had a situation where they delivered a 40-minute presentation and it took them 12 hours of preparation. It was on a complex topic. You were not very familiar with it, right?
Right.
Yeah. Surprisingly, a PhD person studying in that field almost precisely guessed the amount of time. That's crazy. That person should be giving this presentation because wow. So yeah, that tracks. The 4 or 5 is like if you have some competency in the area, right? Like maybe not an expert, but you're at least familiar. If you have no familiarity with the topic at all, it's just going to take forever. Be ready. Especially if it's something not really relevant to your domain expertise. Like, I don't know what you were studying in school, but I imagine that, like, you know, the history and practices around North Korean defectors is probably not something you were super familiar with beforehand. And presenting on that in an academic setting, yeah, 12 hours sounds right. I may not have guessed that much, but yeah, your familiarity with the topic is greatly going to affect how much time it takes you. Because not only are you preparing the presentation, you're also learning about the topic, right? So depending on how complicated the topic is will really drive that time. Something like, North Korean defectors, that is complicated. I can give all sorts of crazy presentation stuff about distributed systems and how to lock and make sure stuff performs well and keep data integrity good, but that topic scares me. Not just due to lack of familiarity, but how complicated that is. So how complicated the topic is the most important factor of how long it's going to take. So especially like geopolitical stuff. Avoid that if you can. What's up?
Now, just wanted to add something for people that don't like presenting, which Beege obviously is not. The more you hate presenting, the more time it would be good to spend practicing to feel better when you're actually up there. Even like going through it 50 times will help you. It'll be a pain in the ass and it'll suck, but it'll help you. And also, if there's any technical component, I highly encourage you to make a screen recording of the technical component, because stuff can break, including code during your presentation, from experience.
Yeah. So to summarize for the stream, if you really just don't like giving presentations, make sure to practice giving the presentation. It will take significantly longer. It won't be comfortable, but you'll get a big benefit from it. And that's actually a really good point. Okay, I'll come back to that. Doing a screen recording of a technical workshop, that's a great idea. I actually did not think of that. So very good tip, Andre. Thank you. Especially because the environment's going to be different. Like, I've had times where, I've had network issues with the network I was on giving a presentation. I couldn't have predicted that, right? I couldn't have tested that beforehand because I'm not on that network, right? So yeah, having a screen recording backup, that's a great idea. I might start doing that. Definitely check that out, folks. I got a question on here and then I'll get yours, okay? So we got a question online. Do you think language fluency influences the quality of the presentation? Yes, absolutely. Great question. Sorry, I forgot that I was a native English speaker for a second. Fluency is definitely going to affect you, just because it takes more mental power to organize your sentence in that language. So earlier I was talking about how you're not going to have idle time. You need to be doing all this multitasking. If you're not fluent in the language, yeah, it's even tougher. So don't be afraid to slow down, okay? Take your time with stuff. And then, as Andre was mentioning, practice more, okay? The more comfortable you are talking about the thing, right? Knowing what kind of grammar structure you're going to use, having the words you're going to use more kind of upfront in your brain, having done it a couple of times, that will greatly improve your performance in the presentation. So yeah, very good question online. I hope that answers your question.
Do you recommend memorizing the script? Because I personally memorize the script. I scribble down what I'm going to say in the presentation before, so that I don't feel nervous during the presentation and I don't get lost in the presentation. But the downside is, if I forget what I'm going to say, I get super nervous.
Right.
So there's the risk. So would you recommend memorizing the script?
So for the recording, the question was, do you recommend memorizing the script to both help things go smoothly and to increase confidence? But then if you forget something, then you're kind of scrambling to figure out where you're at. I don't want to give an absolute recommendation because different people think differently. People retain information differently, all this kind of stuff. But I can tell you what I do. So if you look here, let me pull up the notes actually to use as an example. So you'll see that I have the bullet points from the slide, right? And then beneath that I have the more detailed complete sentences, right? But I'm not reading that, okay? I do some memorization, but I do memorization of the points, not exactly what I'm going to say, okay? So yes, I memorize like the top level points. Or actually, no, I don't memorize the top level points because that's on the slide, right? So I can just look at it. But I do try to memorize the sub bullet points, the general idea, not exactly how I'm going to say it. So I remember like, you know, okay, mental simulations, we want to visualize, you know, we want to talk about, you know, walking into the room. I think about that and I memorize, okay, when I hear simulation, I'm going to think walking into the room. You create these mental triggers. I strongly recommend, we have a presentation we did on the past about how memory works and how to acquire knowledge. I think it's called How to Learn, or maybe it's How to Teach. It's one of the two. It's online. I'll link it later. But you can use that for yourself. You can set up kind of mental triggers to be like, okay, I'm going to associate simulating the presentation with kind of walking into the room and visualizing it, right? You can do these little mental tricks, these associations, to help you kind of track stuff. And then if you absolutely need to, you can kind of, and I do this a lot, I'll kind of buffer in my head the words I'm going to say, but then I'll be reading what's on the screen. That one requires practice though, because I'm sure you've seen this where people kind of short circuit and they just start reading or they start saying what they're reading. There's like some really detailed tricks on how to do that better with kind of your pacing. You'll probably have noticed when like I'll start with a sentence and then I'll kind of pause and I'll gesture and then I'll resume talking because I'm thinking of what I'm going to say next. Okay, so that's a little bit of a trick. But you can do that, kind of say something, buffer what's coming out of your mouth in your head. Maybe you can add some silence through a gesture or something and then quickly read what you wrote. Does that make sense? Cool. So to summarize all of that, memorize kind of the high-level ideas, do some mental triggers to help remind you of what goes when, and then you can use kind of speech patterns and tricks and gestures and stuff to give you time to read what the hell you wrote.
And also have backup, just in case you forget and all that fails. Have the basic structure and the basic points that you can fall back on.
Yeah, and that should be in here. Cool. So, another question online. Do you think that imitating somebody's presentation style is a good first step for improving the presentation skill? That's a good question. I would say in part. So, certain skills and tricks, I would say yes. Mimicking people for certain skills and tricks is good, right? So I mentioned this kind of gesture thing with the pausing while you read. That's just a mechanical thing. Copying that sounds great. But when it comes to like someone's jokes or the specific gestures they do or the kind of energy they give into things, don't mimic that. We talked a lot about how you want to relate with the audience. You want them to feel a kind of personal relationship. If you're just copying someone else's personality, people can sense that, right? It feels fake. It doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel authentic. And that's going to kind of break the relation that you're trying to build. So for mechanics and like skill-based things, copying is cool. For the kind of personality and personal style stuff, not so much. Make your own. And maybe at the beginning, when you're thinking more critically about presentations and trying to figure out your own style, it can be really hard to figure out your own style. But what you can do is, if you're lucky enough, or if you have the ability to record your presentations, go back and watch them. And that's probably something I should have included in the presentation. Go back and look at your presentations, give yourself feedback. Sometimes when I'm doing like CodeSeoul stuff, I'll pull up the YouTube video to make sure the description's up to date, and then I'll just end up watching because I'm like, how did I do on that? Oh no. And that's pretty normal, and that's good to kind of find ways that you can improve. So I should have put that in the presentation. I'm sorry I missed it, but yeah, hopefully that answers the online question. Any other questions before we end? Yeah.
Do you do anything different for like an in-person presentation versus purely virtual presentation? Like family, or is it just the same?
That's a good one. So the question was, do you do anything differently between in-person presentations and virtual online presentations? I haven't really thought about it, and I haven't done too many online presentations. I don't think so. But like I said, I haven't really thought about it a lot, and I haven't done a lot of online. So don't trust that answer. There's definitely a lot of stuff you can reuse from in-person for online. But, you know, like the whole walking around stuff, gesture stuff, that doesn't work well online. So if you're really reliant on those things, you may have to change your style a bit for online. Also, there's like microphone quality and stuff like that, which is why I should really be using these mics instead of this mic. Especially because if you're doing like this is, for online, this is like a worst case scenario what I'm doing now, because the microphone sucks. I have to be loud so you guys can hear me. I might be peaking in the microphone. I'm not sure. Actually, no, I'm peaking. Crap. But yeah, there's a whole bunch more stuff you have to consider with online, but a different kind of stuff. I don't know what that was, and I'm very curious to find out later. Yeah.
Recommendation. I don't like PowerPoint has a pointer.
Oh yeah.
A pointer thing you can use. I've used that a lot in online presentations I've had to give. You could also include more animations. So like only putting up text on the screen that you're currently talking about. They kind of help manage that, understand the flow a little better since you're not playing. Stuff like that is helpful.
So to repeat for the stream what was said, if you're using something like PowerPoint, let me move this. If you're using something like PowerPoint, they have a pointer in there. I think the operating system might also have a pointer too if you're not using PowerPoint or something. So yeah, I do recommend that. That's a great tip. And then, well, I'm sorry, what was the second thing you mentioned?
Including more animations. I get a lot of technical presentations in
Yeah.
only putting up on the screen, or maybe including more transitions, animations, to kind of help them understand.
Got you. So also, and that's actually a weakness of mine, but including more animations, as long as they're just kind of transitional stuff, not like ongoing stuff, including animations can help drive up engagement. Again, we detect motion, we detect change, so anything that's moving will kind of draw us in a little bit, especially for like upper management. So that's a great tip. Thank you. All right. Anything? Oh, we had one more question online, and then we should end. Do you think a short presentation is better than a long presentation? For example, the presentation is finished earlier than the schedule. Yes, absolutely. And this is something I need to work on with CodeSeoul stuff. Finishing the presentation earlier I strongly recommend that, because then you have more time for questions. Because you don't know exactly what the audience's experience is. You don't know exactly what their strengths, what their weaknesses are. And by giving them some amount of control over the information you're giving, just makes for a better presentation. Now, be prepared for that to be difficult, because they're going to ask you questions where you don't know the answer, and you have to be ready to say, I don't know, or you have to be ready to figure it out together. If you're doing technical things, it's also highly likely you'll have someone challenge you on what you tell them. And I'm sure people who have been here a few times have seen that happen to me, because I get some stuff wrong now and then. But it's worth it, because you're doing the presentation for the audience's benefit. By giving them the chance to figure out what they want to learn, that helps them, and that's why you're there. So do whatever you can to help the audience, give them time for questions. And on the note, if anyone does correct you on stuff, gracefully accept the correction. Thank the person. Acknowledge that you were wrong. Basically the stuff that happened in the, what to do, what to do when things go wrong, basically do that. Be like, oh, well, I'm an idiot, right? But this guy clearly knows what he's talking about. Do what he says. Forget what I said, right? Yeah. So I hope that answers the online questions. But we're out of time. So thank you, everyone, for coming. I came up with all this out of my head, but I'll go find some relevant resources and paste them in here. So again, oh wow, I did not update that slide. Sorry, I'll update it later. But thank you all for coming. If you have not been with our group before and you kind of want to engage with our community more, we do have a Discord channel. If you're on your phone, you can just scan that QR code now. That sends to our Discord channel. CodeSeoul is also a legal entity. We are a nonprofit. I don't get paid for this. No one gets paid for this. I actually donate a bunch of money to this. But when we go out for dinner and stuff, CodeSeoul pays for it. So if you want to basically help us do that, feel free to donate. If you don't have income right now, don't donate. Don't do it. You can donate later. It's fine. Or if just you're not in a good situation to donate, don't donate. But if you're happy with what's going on here, if you have the ability to donate comfortably, we are very thankful. We cannot offer tax deductions yet. We're working on that. I need to remind Kyle to send me the lawyer info stuff. But we're working towards that. Hopefully within the next few months, we can get to the next level of nonprofit where we can give tax deductible receipts. But we're not there yet. So if you want to get tax deductible donations, please just wait. We're working on it. But yeah. But again, thank you for your time. Feel free to join us on Discord. We can ask questions. And normally after workshops, we go out for chicken. There's a chicken place nearby. So if you want to come grab chicken together, again, it's on CodeSeoul. Feel free to join us. We can talk more and have a good old time. So thank you everyone for coming, and good night, Internet.